Hi, I'm Gabe from Unsolicited Designs, and in today's video, I'm going to present to you my custom redesigned cards of all the mythics from Murders at Karlov Manor that I graded a C or lower. If you haven't seen my reviews already, go ahead and check out parts 1 and 2 of report cards, where I grade every mythic rare from the set. Now, as part of my redesign process, I try to keep these cards as close to their original iterations as possible. Sometimes the only changes are tweaking the numbers a little bit, or maybe adding a few words here and there. But in most cases, I'm looking to add something to the card that adds a completely new wow factor. Something that I think every mythic rare should have. As I said before, I'm not a professional, and I'm not entirely taking into consideration things like balance for limited environments or other constructed formats. Commander is primarily the area that I'm focusing on. Of course, I'm not trying to be careless with these designs and just make completely overpowered cards, and just cranking the power level to 11. Mostly I just want to build on the foundations of what was already designed, and take it as far as it needs to go to be worthy of mythic rarity status. I hope you enjoy some of my ideas, and I'll do my best to earn a like and subscribe from you before the video is over. So without further ado, I present the redesigned mythic rares for Unsolicited Designs, Murders at Karlov Manor. Alright, our first redesign is Aurelia's Vindicator. Now, this original design I felt was being pulled in two different directions, sort of an aggressive flyer that can help you race since it has lifelink, as well as being a removal spell with some potential recursion benefits as well. Now, I didn't really like that this card was really fragile no matter which way you were trying to use it, and I feel like it needed to be pushed into one direction a little bit more than the others. So here's my redesigned version. First off, you'll see that I changed the mana cost from 4 down to 3. Considering that you can disguise this creature face down for 3 colorless mana, I didn't really see a reason why the disguise cost to turn it face up was basically the same as its actual casting cost. I understand that maybe there's a possibility you can play this creature on turn 3 and then turn it face up on turn 4 so you can be attacking right away, but investing 7 mana into that seems not good. So I also decided to change the disguise cost into XX and white. This way you can still be a little sneaky on turn 3, play it face down, and then get in on turn 4 to attack, but you don't have to take off your whole 4th turn to do that. If you're playing this card that aggressively, 7 mana is just not an option. You can't be taking a whole turn off to turn this card face up. So I feel like this new cost scheme enables you to play this card more aggressively, more efficiently. To balance that out a little, I reduced the power from 4 to 3, and I also increased the toughness from 2 to 3. I don't feel like this card should be played as aggressively, though like I said, I'm still trying to provide that option. But I think turning your mythic rare creature face up and still having it die to a 2-2 in combat is just kind of a no-go. So the new pricing on the disguise cost changes the dynamic of the card just a little bit. You wind up paying a little less mana to exile 1 or 2 creatures, the same amount of mana to exile 3, and then once you get to 4 or more, you're going to be paying more. Again, I think this helps with the cost scheme of the card so that it makes sense to play this card in different ways, either just casting it, putting it face down and turning it face up aggressively, or actually just trying to take advantage of exiling cards. And to make it a little more interesting, I decided to tie its ward ability into this disguise cost as well. So when you flip the angel face up, if X is 2, it'll have ward 2. If X is 3, it'll have ward 3, and so on. I feel like this really helps enable the angel to act as a removal spell, because if it has multiple enemy creatures exiled underneath it, it's going to feel real bad when it gets destroyed. So a scaling ward cost, I thought, was an interesting and effective way to enable it as a more reliable piece of removal. So overall, I think this design makes more sense than the original on any part of your mana curve, and I think it accomplishes its goal more effectively if you want to use this as an actual removal spell. It's not quite as aggressive as before, but I think the trade-off in mana efficiency is far more valuable, and how many people are actually looking to play an aggressive creature that winds up costing 7 mana anyways. Next is Conspiracy Unraveler. My original criticism with this card is mostly about the statting. If you're playing this card, you want to use its ability. So it doesn't make sense to me to have 6 power because that really kind of enables you to just kill your opponent outright in a couple turns. And I feel like if you're threatening to cast spells for free, maybe you shouldn't be able to put your opponent's life total under that much pressure at the same time. So with that in mind, here's my new version. As you can see, I reduced its power down to 3. So it's not exactly toothless, and it's still totally capable of eating most aggressive creatures in combat. I decided this card, since you want to be using its ability, that it could really benefit from a form of protection. Playing off the ward that I gave to Aurelia's Vindicator, I decided I want to try something similar for the Unraveler. This ward I think is probably a little more debatable. I think it certainly can be more powerful. I assume when you're using this card, you're going to construct your deck with a lot of high mana costs in mind, so I would expect my version of the Unraveler to have ward 5 or greater pretty much at any given time. The offset of that is, with the ward working this way, it would create a little bit of tension in what cards you decide to leave in your graveyard and which ones you decide to exile to pay for that collect evidence cost. I was really tempted to change how the collect evidence ability worked on this card, but I think that's pretty volatile. As I've said before, being able to cast spells for free I think is the most powerful thing you can do in the game. And since I really wasn't doing a lot of playtesting with these ideas, I didn't want to mess with something I didn't fully understand. Overall, as I've said, I think Conspiracy Unraveler is a card that you want to be activating its collect evidence ability multiple times, and this new version lets you focus on doing just that. Okay, Intrude on the Mind. Now, I went through a lot of iterations of this card. I had a lot of different ideas that I wanted to use, but it turned out balancing it and keeping it kind of in the same vein as it was originally designed was a major challenge. Tying in the size of the creature you can get to the number of cards you might be able to see proved a pretty tricky balance, as my initial instinct was to just make you see more cards. But after a lot of contemplation, I actually came up with several ideas that I was pretty excited about, so I actually have 3 iterations of this card. Again, I tried to stick closely to what this card originally does, but I wanted to do it in a new and unique and exciting way. So the first version here is probably the most powerful one. First of all, every version of this card that I came up with had to use the original templating of Fact or Fiction, where your opponent makes the piles and then you get to choose. To me, the mechanic of making a 0/0 and then putting +1/+1 on counters on it didn't make a lot of sense for blue, so I decided that generating multiple Thopters was more logical. Now, with Magic, I think that the cards that let you scale the possibilities are the most exciting. Cards that let you really dream big. So rather than Intrude on the Mind generate a number of Thopters based on the number of cards you put in your graveyard using it, why not let that scale to any number of cards that are put into your graveyard this turn? This opens up the door to so many other possibilities and combinations, and it'll probably encourage you to use this card differently. Sure, you probably want to cast this on the end of one of your opponent's turns so that you don't have to spend that mana on your turn, but now you can line it up if you have a really big turn coming where you're going to be sacrificing multiple creatures, or milling yourself, or just casting a lot of spells. Now, definitely this has the potential to go way over the top and generate way more Thopters than maybe it should. So the second version of this card is more or less the same, but uses that wonderful phrase, one or more cards are put into your graveyard. That way, if you really want to get multiple Thopters out of this card, you need multiple instances of putting cards into your graveyard. I think that's less fun and less exciting, but maybe a little bit more balanced, so I thought I'd just throw that one out there too. But my third iteration is the one that I wanted to lean more into, but just couldn't find exactly the right balance for, and that's using a set mechanic like Cloak. Again, I think this one you have to be a little more careful with, since 2/2s are obviously better than 1/1s, though with flying I guess that's debatable. But again, I thought this iteration might be interesting enough to consider. Now we arrive at Melek, Reforged Researcher. So with this card, I was pretty happy with the power level. I think it's going to be a pretty large creature rather easily, but I felt like the mana discount it was offering on new instants and sorceries didn't quite rise to the level of mythic, especially compared to some other recent rares that were printed. So if you take a look at my redesigned version, you'll see I've mostly kept the power and toughness the same, except I wanted to add an important clause to the ability. The Izzet Guild has used the Jumpstart ability in the past, and that ability puts your instants and sorceries into exile. And during that set, they specifically designed cards that cared about instants and sorceries in your graveyard and in exile. So it only seemed natural to me that Melek would count those cards in exile as well. And while the 3 generic mana discount is pretty strong, I felt that being limited to only 1 spell a turn, it could really use some improvement too. So my version of the card makes your instants and sorceries cost 1 less for each card of that same type in exile or in the graveyard. So for example, if you have 2 instants in your graveyard and 1 in exile, the first instant you cast will cost 3 generic mana less. I thought about uncapping this ability to just make it so it applied to every instant and sorcery you cast, but again I wanted to stay a little true to the design and not go too over the top with the power level. I also had a little bit of inspiration from Melek's power and toughness design, and I thought it might be interesting to have a second version of the card, which you can see here, and this one eschews the mana discount in favor of granting Melek flying and trample if you have enough instants or sorceries in your graveyard and in exile. I liked this idea as it kind of played into more of the power and toughness of Melek and really would pose a serious threat to your opponents instead of being so easily chump blocked without any of these bonuses. Overall, I think there's some pretty cool design space here with Melek that you can explore, and having done these redesigned versions, I think I have a better appreciation for the power and toughness that he gets. I think it does add up to be a little more significant than I first interpreted, but I'm pretty happy with my ideas here, and I think I'd like to see them explored on maybe some future Izzet cards. Okay, so with Rakdos, Patron of Chaos, I didn't really have a whole lot of negative things to say about this card. The flavor made sense to me. The mechanics seemed a little off, and so I thought a lot about changing the mechanics, but it got a little wordy and a little convoluted and got a little too far away from the original design. So instead I opted to just try and solve the gameplay element problem I saw with this card, where optimally you should probably be targeting the same opponent over and over again to really make life hard on them, and give you the best odds of drawing cards, which is really what you want to be doing. I think that type of gameplay loop is probably not a whole lot of fun to be on the receiving end of. So to mitigate that, and to really sell that this is a Rakdos card, and Rakdos really love chaos and disorder, I thought a really easy and elegant solution is just to insert choosing your opponent at random. Again, I think that plays into Rakdos flavor, and it alleviates the potential negative feelings you might get from using this card in the most optimal way possible. So a simple solution, but what's the point of reinventing the wheel? Or the demon in this case, I guess. Okay, so with Trostani 3 Whispers, my complaints about this card wasn't necessarily that it wasn't powerful enough. I think this card actually is going to be quite irritating to face off against. It will make combat annoying for you and for every other opponent of this card, because basically no matter what's going on, the Trostani player can decide which creatures are going to live or die this combat. So I think that's unique in its own way. These abilities haven't appeared on a single card like this before, and the ability to just add these keywords to any creature at any time for relatively low mana cost is something that we haven't seen. However, I don't think that's really quite mythic enough, so I decided to try and add an ability that we haven't seen before. So looking at my iteration here of Trostani, I kept all those keyword granting abilities and just merged it into one activated ability. This loses the cute element where we get to use green mana, white mana, and green or white mana, but I think it balances out the card actually a little bit by forcing the use of both green and white mana. That will limit the number of activations possibly that the Trostani player can get in any given turn, and it really solidifies this card as a green-white card and makes it a little bit harder to splash in other decks. When I was thinking of what to do with this card, I really was trying to focus more on what Selesnya Guild is all about, and to me that's lots of token creatures, lots of small token creatures. And because I felt one of the traps of this card was what a hungry mana sink it was, and by demanding you leave so much mana available at any given time, it would really limit your board development, I decided to give this card the ability to generate some mana for you. It requires a decent number of creatures in addition to tapping Trostani, and that way it limits itself to just one activation per turn cycle. I think it also encourages you to use the Vigilance ability a little more frequently, and over the course of a long game, it will actually alleviate all the mana issues you might be having with this card. That'll allow you to continuously dominate combat for basically the rest of the game and develop your board state at the same time. Plus, I thought the idea of creating a land token was something neat that really hasn't been explored yet and really gives this card a mythic feel. Going through this redesigned version now, I feel like I probably should tone down the power and toughness a little bit as well. And with these changes in mind, I could see the card just being a 3/3. Again, this card probably doesn't really need the power boost specifically, but overall I think I really came up with an idea here that was unique and mythic worthy. Alright, Urgent Necropsy. So this card, I had problems with the fact that it may actually do nothing. If you don't have a graveyard at all, or if you don't have enough mana value packed into your graveyard, you're going to pay 4 mana and be unable to destroy anything at all. The other complaint I have with this card is the wording and the fact that just by reading the text, if you don't have a full understanding of collect evidence, you might actually feel like you can't cast this card if you don't have the exact right mana value of cards in your graveyard equal to the targets that you want to destroy. So looking at my version of the card, I can't really say that my wording is perfect. I don't actually know that it's perfect. In fact, there's a good chance that it's also unclear. So, at the risk of being a little hypocritical with their wording, here's my offering. What I decided would be a better version of this card is that you get to choose up to one artifact, one creature, one enchantment, one planeswalker, and destroy any given one of those things just by casting this card. So whether you can collect evidence or not, you're at least getting something from this card. So to counterbalance that, I thought it made sense to make this a sorcery by default, so that way it's at least not as good straight off the bat, but if you are able to collect evidence, you get the bonus of being able to cast this as an instant, in addition to targeting multiple permanents. Essentially, this is just straight up upgrade of the card, increasing the power level in more or less every respect. Since with my version of the card, even if you just exile a land from your graveyard, you could get to be able to cast this at instant speed. So I acknowledge this version is pretty much just straight up better than the original version, and that the wording probably isn't all that clean, but I think it's important that your cards do something at a minimum, and being a mythic, I think getting a bonus on top is fair. You'll have to let me know in the comments if this text makes sense to you and if I've described it well enough so that you understand it. Hopefully I didn't miss the mark too bad there, but I'm pretty happy with this improved version. There's really nothing worse than just looking at cards in your hand that do nothing and you don't get to play the game, so I think this is a step in the right direction at the very least. And the last card we're redesigning today is Vannifar, Evolved Enigma. Now my original complaints with this card is that more or less I don't like the morph mechanic. I feel like you're casting your creatures twice. You have to pay a 3 mana premium just to put the creature into play, and then cast it again for its morph cost or its disguise cost so that you can get its triggered ability. I think this mechanic basically just makes you cast your creatures twice. It puts you at a disadvantage to your opponents. I think you're spending way more mana to get these effects than you really need to be getting. And if you leave mana up trying to wait for the right opportunity to turn one of these creatures face up and it doesn't present itself, then you're putting yourself way behind. So I think this mechanic is fun. You can be sneaky and try and trick your opponents, but in the long run, I think you're really only playing yourself. So with that in mind, I felt like this card needed to do just a little bit extra. And so looking at my version here, we have the same options of cloaking a card from your hand or putting a +1/+1 counter on each colorless creature you control. But then I thought just to go one step further, but I like the idea of being able to return one of your creatures back to your hand, which will generate a card for you, as well as allow you to get a second activation out of its face-up ability. Beyond that, I think it also opens up the card to be used in other strategies, just not face-down strategies. And if we're being honest, how can you have a Simic card and not have the text draw a card written on it somewhere? I also realized the wording on that last ability should say a creature you control to its owner's hand. Otherwise, technically the way this card works as written, if you have mind controlled one of your opponent's creatures, you can bounce it to your hand. So that's a little bit of an oversight. But I think you understand the spirit of the changes, and I think this little extra improvement goes a long way towards making this card more powerful and making the strategy a little bit more appealing as well. And there we have it. Those are my redesigned versions of the Mythics from Murders at Karlov Manor that I feel just didn't quite make the cut. But I'd love to hear what you think of my new versions. Are they too powerful? Did we not go far enough? And what are some ideas that you might have to make these cards feel more mythic? At the very least, I hope my ideas gave you something to think about and maybe get you excited for some more possibilities of future mythics that we could see down the line. This was a fun exercise in creativity and trying my hand at designing cards for myself. I think everyone who's played the game, it's something they've thought about doing from time to time, and we gotta say it was pretty interesting coming up with these ideas, reworking them over and over a few times, and then presenting them here to you. It's an interesting learning experience, and I'll be interested to see what feedback I get on these designs, because I was providing that feedback in my review videos, and now that I've put these cards out there myself, it'll be fun to see what kind of criticism I get. And honestly, just having presented them all like this, there's definitely a few changes I already have in mind for reworking them again. So I can only imagine what it's like for the designers over at Wizards of the Coast. Again, I think they do a great job. This definitely isn't easy, and I'm not even taking into consideration any of the many factors that I'm sure that they have in mind. Anyways, that's all for this video. I want to thank you for watching, and I hope I earned a like and a subscribe from you. I hope you'll check back next week when I have a discussion with my good friends Sean and Colin about the overall set, Murders of Karlov Manor. We're going to be talking about the art, the themes, the flavor, and the mechanics of the set, and I think you'll enjoy our discussion. Once again, I'm Gabe from Unsolicited Designs, and who asked me anyways?